use inverse operations. Who can tell me? Raise your hand. What does it mean, inverse? Inverse operations. Alex, what does it mean? Opposite. Perfect. Let's put that in parentheses. Opposite. When solving equations, equations have equal signs. When solving equations, use inverse operations, and inverse means opposite. Aurora, what's the opposite of add? What's the opposite? If I was going to do the opposite of adding, what's the opposite of adding? Subtracting. The opposite of adding is subtracting. But we have to add something into that piece of information. Because sometimes it's not going to be an adding. Sometimes that plus sign isn't telling us that the number is being added. Sometimes that plus sign is telling us that it's a positive value. So adding and positive numbers. The opposite of adding and the opposite of positive numbers is to subtract them. Right? Two-step equations, inverse operations. We have to do the opposite. The opposite to solve these. What's the opposite? Raise your hand who can tell me. What's the opposite of subtracting? Adding. But again, you have to recognize sometimes that minus sign is not just meaning subtracting. Sometimes it means that it's a negative value. And sometimes our brain has a hard time remembering that negatives and subtracting are similar. Who can tell me what's the opposite of multiplying? Opposite of multiplying, Jordan? Dividing. And sometimes we have to remember that they're touching. It's not necessarily that there is a multiplication sign, that the number and the variable are touching. That means that they're being multiplied. So if the opposite of multiplying is dividing, what's the opposite of dividing? Multiplying. Now, sometimes there's a division symbol, but lots of times it's going to be a fraction now. It's going to be under. It's going to be underneath a variable. And if it's under, if it's below, if it's below, it's under, it means it's dividing. So let's talk through our rules of solving. Step number 1. Draw a line down the equal sign. And the reason we're doing this is because it helps us stay organized. Because we're going to talk about two-step equations today. We're going to review two-step equations. Which two-step equations you have to do 2 steps. However, we're going to continue on this year. Last year we stopped at two-step equations. This year we're going to continue on. We're going to do multi-step equations. Sometimes there are 5 steps. Sometimes there are 6 steps to do the problem. You have to stay organized, because if you're not organized, that's where we run into bigger problems. So we're going to draw a line down the equal sign to keep us organized. Right now, we're going to circle the constant, which is a vocabulary word. The constant is the lonely number. It's the number that doesn't have a variable with it. It's all alone. The constant. You're going to circle the constant and draw a square around the coefficient. If the constant's the lonely number, the coefficient is the number with the variable. Constant is the just value by itself, just the number. You're going to circle the constant and you're going to draw a square around the coefficient. You need to be able to identify them. Constant, coefficient. I'm going to use those vocabulary words a lot. Constant, coefficient. So step number 1, draw a line down the equal sign to stay organized. Step number 2, circle the constant, draw a square around the coefficient. You have to identify the values. Step 3, you're going to move the constant. Which one's the constant? The lonely number, the number without the variable. Move the constant using inverse operations. Constant using inverse operations. Step 1, draw a line down the equal sign. Step 2, circle the constant, draw a square around the coefficient. Step 3, move the constant using inverse operations. What are inverse operations? What does that mean?
Opposite.
The opposite. So if it said plus 3, what would you do? Minus 3, subtract 3, good. Then we move the coefficient using inverse operations. Move the coefficient. The constant is what number? Which one's the constant?
Mr. Lonely.
It's the lonely number. It's the number without the variable. Which one's the coefficient? The one with the variable. We move the coefficient, the one with the variable, using inverse operations. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, this one people skip all the time and it blows my mind. Use a calculator to check.
What do you use a calculator to do?
Use a calculator to check your answer. Use a calculator to check your answer. You will know if it's right or wrong. If you take your answer and you substitute it, what does that mean to substitute? Replace. If you replace the variable, the letter, with the answer you got, and it works, you're good. All right, everybody should have their yellow calculator in front of them. We are going to talk through these steps. When you have finished writing those notes, here's our practice. It is on page 10. I'm going to leave these directions up on the screen.
Do it by yourself.